What makes Half-Life fun? Is it this? Maybe, but let's stop and think about this for a second. If you played a video game where this was all you did for 8 hours, would it really be that much fun? Probably not. So let's ask ourselves again, what really makes Half-Life fun? In 2 words, variety and pacing. See, earlier first-person shooters were a lot of fun. You strafed around these hideous beasts and skillfully dodged their volleys of projectiles, watching as their bodies crumple to the floor under the might of your super shotgun. But when everyone was dead, you had to wander, and wander, and wander some more. These games were filled with empty corridors and mazes, and the pacing suffered greatly as a result. In the immortal words of Ross Scott,
I think a lot of people get blinded by the nostalgia of Doom and forget that once you take away the demon shooting, the game turns into a chore.
So what does Half-Life do differently? Well, it structures its gameplay around 4 core pillars. Run, think, shoot, live. In this video, we're going to go over each of these in detail, and look at how they all come together throughout the game. Run. Like most shooters from the era, Half-Life's gameplay is centered on movement. The player can run and jump at high speeds, duck under obstacles, and crouch jump to reach areas too high for a normal jump. A few other forms of movement pop up throughout the game, like swimming, vehicles, and giant fans, and they all work as you'd expect, except for the ladders. Valve just can't do ladders. There are more advanced tricks to go faster and move in different ways, but we're not going to go into any of them here because they're not intended features, and honestly I'm just not good enough at any of them to get usable footage. Unlike a lot of newer games, Half-Life makes good use of all of its movement mechanics throughout the campaign. Brief platforming sections are common, used to keep the entire game from being a mess of empty hallways. Players are forced to crawl through vents frequently, adding to the realistic qualities of the game and giving it a more exploratory feel, a lot like the later sections of Portal. And of course, movement is important in combat, but we'll talk about that later. Personally, I find Half-Life's movement is a really good compromise between a realistic experience and a fun one. Of course, nobody can actually run through a facility like this for hours at a time without any breaks, and the suit wouldn't help much either, but Half-Life doesn't treat it so unrealistically that you can do things like this. Still, if vent crawling and platforming were all you did between fights in this game, that could get a bit boring, so Half-Life forces the player to think. Now, there aren't any real puzzles in this game, and it almost never turns into a maze, but the way to progress isn't always immediately clear. Let's take this spot in surface tension. There's a large door here that the player will almost definitely notice because of size, direction entering, where enemies are placed, etc, etc. Next to it is a little terminal with another door, but it's locked. Nearby is a bounce pad, leading to a small set piece, followed by another little moment and a bit more combat. There's a security guard up here who has to open a door to get back outside, which tells the player to take him to the other locked door they saw earlier. The thing is, this whole 5-minute chunk of gameplay could have been entirely cut out if this door was already unlocked. So why is it here? Well, it helps with the pacing. Before this moment, there was a fight against an osprey, a fight against a bunch of enemies, a bit of a jump scare, and a fight against a few more enemies. And through the door is this. So if players didn't get a break with minimal combat between all these major battles, it would be fairly exhausting. Because so much of Half-Life is spent fighting, it's good to have some breaks between the shoot. Enemies in this game can only do one thing at a time. This might seem obvious, but it's important to point out because it fundamentally shapes the way these enemies are fought. Older FPS games often use projectile-based combat as often as they could, avoiding hit-scan weapons that may slow things down and turn the game into a slog. The same single-action limitation applied to them as well, but often the period between actions was so brief that it gave off the illusion of more complicated behavior. Half-Life takes the opposite approach here, and uses these periods between actions as chances to provide information to the player. For example, when an enemy is shot and chooses to turn around, the player knows that it will be retreating. If it stops and does a highly telegraphed attack animation, the player knows it's about to attack. Almost all combat in Half-Life revolves around hit-scan weapons, so the best way to dodge an attack is to recognize that an enemy is about to fire and then run behind cover. Enemies in Half-Life are smarter than they were in older games too. In fact, one of Half-Life's major selling points was its groundbreaking artificial intelligence. Now, not every enemy shows this off, but the ones that do really do. Hound Eyes will act with pack-like behavior, and soldiers have an entire squad system, allowing them to communicate with each other and work together to simulate an actual squad of well-trained Marines. Links to some fantastic videos explaining these in more detail can be found in the description, but I'm going to go into what this means for the gameplay. Soldiers run around between shots, retreat after taking damage, telegraph what they're doing with voice lines, trash talk, and throw so many grenades. When they attack, the player is forced to duck behind cover to avoid taking damage, only getting a chance to attack when they stop. Because of this, the soldier's AI effectively controls every combat encounter with them. This is important because in games like Doom, you're always in control. You strafe around these enemies and take advantage of their attacks to make them vulnerable. Again, these other games provide their own experiences, but Half-Life gives you this real feeling of being the underdog in any fight, overcoming squads of highly trained military personnel by taking advantage of when they aren't able to fight back. This all comes together to give combat a cat-and-mouse type rhythm, with the odds shifting in and out of the player's favor. Other enemies have similar behavior, the alien grunts have a shorter window of vulnerability, and the assassins can feel flat-out unfair with how much they force the player to move and strategize. They might be just a bit overpowered, especially on hard mode. Other enemies throughout the game can be fun to fight as well. One of the few that attacks with ordinary projectiles can also fly, still keeping the player at a disadvantage. Other enemies from earlier in the game can become stronger from placement and numbers, and some enemies are so large that entire chapters revolve around them. Then there's the alien slaves, who show another dimension to the enemy's intelligence. They'll actually cease fighting altogether if injured enough, only defending themselves if the player corners them. It hints toward their role in the greater storyline of the series, and this is reinforced toward the end of the game. Like every other part of Half-Life, the gameplay ties into the storyline, showing that just like you, the primary goal of all of these creatures is to live. So using these three previous components, let's look at how a small section of the game progresses, and see what a player needs to do to survive. As the player crawls out of this drainage pipe, they're likely to immediately notice this turret and take it out before it could give them a single problem because they've played this game 50 times and they totally remembered that it was there. Then kill this guy too. Then they can look over this beautiful, somewhat blurry vista and realize, hey, this is a cliff. So they'll already know that they'll need to be careful not to fall off. There are two routes along the cliff, each presenting their own challenges. As the player carefully makes their way across the upper level, they will fight a soldier and have to figure out that they can slide down this pipe. Or, if the player is a bit more observant, they'll notice an alternate path, leading to another soldier and a little secret area with some health. This leads to an old wooden bridge. Running across doesn't work, crawling across doesn't work, jumping across usually doesn't work, so the player will need to notice that while the boards are breaking, the cables connecting them aren't, and simply walk along them instead. Both routes lead to a small alcove with a shotgun-wielding soldier to ambush you, and then this. Because of the route the chopper takes, the player will almost certainly run back toward these doors, head in, find this rocket launcher, and... what? Okay, so they'll run in, find this rocket launcher, and take the helicopter down. Now think for a second, how easy would it have been to replace this whole thing with some generic sewer section? It starts with a drainage pipe, they could have easily gotten away with that. Then there's a bit of climbing, a bit of not falling, a bit of crawling around. Then while the player is going through this pipe, they'll hear this. Obviously, a fight is just up ahead. So here's how I handled this encounter. Jump out of this pipe, blast this guy into another dimension, gun down this guy, crawl through this little tunnel to avoid grenades, shoot at this guy then blow him up with a grenade, miss the next grenade, fall into the hole by accident, gun down this guy while crouching to make myself a smaller target, no clue if this works or not, but it makes me feel better, peek around this corner and fire off a few shells, jump down to avoid the blast from this grenade, check for the soldier who's down here sometimes, resume peeking with the shotgun, take care of this tank with a few rockets and bullets, and shoot at this guy on the other side. Done. It might seem easy, and sometimes it is, but it's surprising just how much can go wrong in this fight. The key is to take everybody down as fast as you can before they even get a chance to fight back. There are so many angles to begin the fight from, and so many ways the NPCs can react that the battle never plays out the same way twice. Oh, before we wrap this up, I'd like to touch on friendly NPCs. Guards and scientists around the facility will be glad to help Gordon out on his adventure, and while they're not very good at it, they'll often get a couple shots in or at least serve as a distraction. Scientists can give the player extra health, guards drop ammo, and they talk to each other too.
Don't you find this all rather fascinating?
Nope.
Well, there we go. That's about everything the majority of Half-Life's gameplay has to offer. That isn't even getting into sections like this or this, but those are best saved for other videos. I'll be honest, it's not perfect, but it's definitely not a chore to play either. Half-Life is often overlooked in discussions of shooters with good gameplay, and honestly, I find that a little unfair. Because hey, it's fun, it makes you think, and it does as much as it can to keep the player from getting bored. We'll be seeing how much variety there is in future episodes when we cover the game's chapters. In fact, there should be a little poll in the corner to let you all choose what I cover next time. I'd love to hear what you thought of this episode, as well as any suggestions for improvements in the comments below. Thank you all very much for watching.
I will see you up ahead.
In fact, I'll put a little poll up in the corner here to let you all choose what I cover next. Fucking car, that was a good take! Ugh.